Top 10 African countries that makes up 50% of Africans' wealth. There are around 136,000 people in Africa with an asset value of $1 million or even more. However, only 6,700 have assets worth more than $10 million. Only 305 Africans hold individual property valued at least $100 million, with only 21 billionaires across the continent. For some African countries, the oil industry represents an enormous source of income. In Nigeria, oil generates almost 10% of the country's GDP. However, economies such as Libya, Algeria, or Angola are even more and more dependent on the oil sector. In Libya, for instance, oil rents account for over 40% of the GDP. Indeed, Libya is one of the economies most dependent on oil worldwide. Similarly, oil represents for some Africans' largest economies a substantial source of export value. As per this year's African Wealth Report issued by UK investment consultancy firm Helen & Partners in collaboration with South African wealth intelligence business New World Wealth, we are going to be talking about top 10 African countries that controls 50% of the Africans' total wealth. But let's take a pause. Welcome to Afro Page, and if you're new here, please take out some time to hit the subscription button and notification bell to always get notified when we upload new videos. And now back to the video. Number 10 on our list is Ghana. The gross domestic product GDP in Ghana was worth $77.59 billion in 2021, according to the official data from the World Bank. GDP in Ghana is expected to reach $72 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics Global Macro Models and Analyst expectations. The economy of Ghana has a diverse and rich resource base, including the manufacturing and exportation of digital technology goods, automotive and ship construction and exportation, and the exportation of diverse and rich resources such as hydrocarbons and industrial minerals. The Ghanaian domestic economy in 2012 revolved around services, which accounted for 50% of the GDP and employed 28% of the workforce. Besides the industrialization association with minerals and oil, industrial development in Ghana remains basic, often associated with plastics such as chairs, plastic bags, razors, and pens. 53.6% of Ghana's workforce were employed in agriculture in 2013. Ghana makes up 2.49% of the total African GDP. Number 9. Tanzania. The economy of Tanzania is a lower middle-income economy that is overwhelmingly dependent on agriculture. Tanzania's economy has been transitioning from a command economy to a market economy since 1985. Although total GDP has increased since these reforms began. GDP per capita dropped sharply at first and only exceeded the pre-transition figure in around 2007. The gross domestic product GDP in Tanzania was worth $67.78 billion in 2021, according to official data from the World Bank. Economic activity in Tanzania is recovering, with the 2022 real GDP growth rate projected to reach 4 to 5%. The accommodation and restaurants, mining, ICT, transport, and electricity sectors are driving the recovery. Tanzania makes up a total of 2.65% of the total African GDP. Number 8. Ethiopia. Ethiopia has one of the fastest growing economies in the world and is Africa's second most populous country. Many properties owned by the government during the previous regime have now been privatized or are in the process of privatization, and the liberalization of its financial sector is the near future. However, certain sectors such as the telecommunications, financial and insurance services, air and land transportation services, and retail are considered as strategic sectors and are expected to remain under state control for the foreseeable future. Almost 50% of the Ethiopia's population is under the age of 18. Even though education enrollment at primary and tertiary level has increased significantly, job creation has not caught up with the increased output from educational institutes. The country must create hundreds of thousands of jobs every year just to keep up with population growth. The gross domestic product (GDP) in Ethiopia was worth $101.27 billion in 2021, according to the official data from the World Bank. GDP in Ethiopia is expected to reach $112 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics. Ethiopia makes up total of 3.54% of Africa's GDP. Number 7. Kenya. Kenya, which accounts for 91 billion of the total private wealth held in Africa, situated in East Africa near the coastline of Indian Ocean. Kenya has a population of more than 54 million inhabitants with a GDP of 110.4 billion as of 2022 economically. Kenya is East Africa's largest and most important business, financial, and transportation hub. The country is well known for its vast landscape and wildlife, with stable living conditions and an established coffee and tea sector. Its rapidly growing agricultural sector is the wealthiest in the Southeast and Central Africa over the years. Its coastline has become an arena for numerous strategic ports for Asian and Arabian traders over the years. Interestingly, unlike other less developed countries, Kenya doesn't get her income mainly from the oil sector. Rather, the country aids its strong and positive investment building a vibrant service sector and other lucrative business. In 2019, the nation emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa. All these investments and activities bring forth about 4.6 real GDP to the country. Agriculture sector has contributed to a lot of its GDP, be with coffee, tea, and maize as the main crops produced. This has fostered exportations. The country has also experienced tourism and fast financial growth in previous years. Kenya makes up 3.38% of the total African GDP. Number 6. Angola. The economy of Angola advanced by 3.6% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2022. Following an upward reversed 2.8% rise in the previous 3 months period, it was the strongest growth rate since the first quarter of 2015, mainly due to a strong rebound in diamonds and other minerals extraction. Positive contributions also came from transport and storage, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and oil extraction. Conversely, steep declines were observed in finance and insurance due to the fall in bank earnings from commercial activities and post and telecommunications. On a quarterly basis, the GDP rose after increasing by 1.2% in the previous quarter. The government sees the economy expanding by 2.7% in 2022, supported by growth in the non-oil sector of 3.2% and the oil sector, including gas, of 2.1%. The gross domestic product (GDP) in Angola was worth $72.55 billion in 2021, according to official data from the World Bank. GDP in Angola is expected to reach $74 billion by the end of 2022. Angola makes up 4.20% of the total African GDP. Number 5. Morocco. The economy of Morocco is considered a relatively liberal economy governed by the law of supply and demand. Since 1993, Morocco has followed a policy of privatization of certain economic sectors which used to be in the hands of the government. Morocco has become a major player in African economy affairs, and it is the 5th largest African economy by GDP, with 4.48% of the total African GDP. The World Economic Forum placed Morocco as the first most competitive economy in North Africa. The gross domestic product (GDP) in Morocco was worth $132.73 billion in 2021, according to official data from the World Bank. GDP in Morocco is expected to reach $122 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics global macro models and analyst expectations. The service sector accounts for just over half of the GDP. The industry sector, consisting of mining, construction, and manufacturing, is an additional quarter. The sectors that recorded the highest growth are the tourist, telecoms, and textile sectors. Morocco, however, still depends to an inordinate degree on agriculture, which accounts for around 14% of the GDP, but it employs 40 to 45% of the Moroccan population. With a semi-arid climate, it is difficult to assure good rainfall, and Morocco's GDP varies depending on the weather. Fiscal prudence has allowed for consolidation, with both the budget deficit and debt falling as a percentage of GDP. Number 4. Algeria. Gross domestic product (GDP) in Algeria was worth $167.98 billion in 2021, according to official data from the World Bank. GDP in Algeria is expected to reach $165 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics Global Macro Models and Analyst expectations. The oil and gas sector is the country's main source of revenues and generated about 70% of the total budget receipts. The economy was projected to grow by 3.2% in 2013 and by 4.0% in 2014. Oil and gas export earnings made up more than 97% of total exports. Algeria has enormous possibilities to boost its economic growth, including huge foreign exchange reserves derived from oil and gas. A development strategy to getting stronger, sustained growth would create more jobs, especially for young people, and alleviate the housing shortage the country is facing. Algeria has a total of 6.52% of the total African GDP. Number 3. South Africa. The economy of South Africa is the third largest in Africa and the most industrialized, technologically advanced, and diversified economy in Africa overall. Having 14.33% of the total African GDP, South Africa is an upper-middle income economy, one of only 8 of such countries in Africa. Following 1996, at the end of over 12 years of international sanctions, South Africa's gross domestic product almost tripled to its current peak at $416 billion in 2011. In the same period, foreign exchange reserves increased from $3 billion to nearly $50 billion, creating a diversified economy with a growing and sizable middle class within 2 decades of ending apartheid. Although the natural resource extraction industry remains one of the largest in the country, with an annual contribution to the GDP of $13.5 billion. The economy of South Africa has diversified since the end of apartheid, particularly towards service. The gross domestic product (GDP) in South Africa was worth $419.95 billion in 2021, according to the official data from the World Bank. GDP in South Africa is expected to reach $345 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics Global Macro Models and Analyst expectations. Number 2 on our list is Egypt. The economy of Egypt used to be a highly centralized economy focused on importing substitution under President Gamal Abdel Nasser 1954 to 1970. During the rule of the President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi 2014 to date, the economy follows Egypt's 2030 vision. The policy is aimed at diversifying Egypt's economy. The country's economy is the second largest in Africa after Nigeria regarding nominal GDP and the 35th in worldwide ranking as of 2022. Since the 2000s, the pace of structural reforms helped Egypt move towards a more market-oriented economy and prompted increased foreign investment. The reforms and policies have strengthened macroeconomic annual growth results. As Egypt's economy healed, other prominent issues like unemployment and poverty began to decline significantly. The country benefits from political stability, its proximity to Europe, and increased exports. It also enjoys a strong currency. The gross domestic product (GDP) in Egypt was worth $404.14 billion in 2021, according to the official data from the World Bank. GDP in Egypt is expected to reach $340 billion by the end of 2022, according to the Trading Economics Global Macro Models and Analyst expectations. Agriculture makes up 11.7% of the country's GDP. Industry makes up 34.3% of the country's GDP, while services makes up 54% of the country's GDP, leaving it to be the second largest in Africa, with 14.65% making up 50% of Africa's GDP. Number 1 on our list is Nigeria. The economy of Nigeria is a middle-income, mixed economy and emerging market with expanding manufacturing, finance, service, communications, technology, and entertainment sectors. It is ranked as the 27th largest economy in the world in terms of nominal gross domestic product and the 24th largest in terms of purchasing power parity. Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa with 17.17% of the total African GDP. The country's re-emergent manufacturing sector became the largest on the continent in 2013, and it produces a large portion of goods and services for the region of West Africa. In addition, the debt-to-GDP ratio was 16.075% as of 2019. Although oil revenues contributes 2 to 3 of state revenues, oil also contributes about 9% of the GDP. Nigeria produces only about 2.7% of the world's oil supply. Although the petroleum sector is important, as government revenue still heavily relies on this sector, it remains a small part of the country's overall economy. The gross domestic product GDP in Nigeria was worth $440.78 billion in 2021, according to the official data from the World Bank. The Nigeria's 2022 GDP is expected to grow above $500 billion. The just mentioned 10 African countries makes up 50% of the total African GDP, which stands as of 2022 at roughly $2.9 trillion. This was the highest value since 2010, when the continent's GDP amounted to approximately $2 billion. And that brings us to the end of today's video. Do like this video and share with your loved ones. Till next time.